What is up, metal and heavy music fans? It's your boy Flight of Icarus at metaltrenches.com, and after reviewing Guardians, I felt like it was high time to do a tier list and rank the discography of Pennsylvania metalcore band August Burns Red. But before I do that, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel and stick around afterwards because there's plenty more videos like this one to enjoy. Now, as I said in that review, it's a little hard to rate these guys from album to album because essentially they've kind of sounded the same, give or take, for years. That said, I'm going to do my best to kind of hash out some of the minor gradient differences between all of these albums and separate them from the best to the only slightly less great. Because let's face it, I don't think these guys have truly made a bad album at this point. We got to start all the way back at the beginning in 2005 with Thrill Seeker. This was through Solid State Records, which was a label they would stay on for the next 5 albums. This is the only album to feature original vocalist Josh McManus, and I remember it was a pretty big album at the time. I recall seeing this cover around all over the place, especially places like, Hot Topic, and it came out, though, in a pretty big year for metalcore. Now, just think of this, okay? This drops, and it's alongside Avenged Sevenfold City of Evil, Trivium's Ascendancy, As I Lay Dying, Shadows Are Security, The Black Dahlia Murders, Miasma, Protest the Heroes, Kezia, Every Time I Die's Gutter Phenomenon, Between the Buried and Me's, Alaska, Darkest Hours, Undoing Ruin, Norma Jean's, Oh God, the Aftermath, and The Bleds Found in the Flood. That's a pretty big year and some steep competition. So that said, I feel like out of all of those, this is kind of my least favorite and the least interesting as far as those go. It's a fine album, but it's a little bit generic, especially in comparison to what was to come for this band and also all those other albums. So I could see why at the time it was a pretty cool thing to be listening to, but ultimately it's pretty standard stuff. It's solid, it's enjoyable, it's a very listenable album. I'm particularly fond of Barbarian, but again, in the bigger scheme of things, it's pretty average, and ultimately I have to put it at C tier. Not bad, but just there's plenty much more to come at this point. So let's move along here to 2007 with Messengers. Now, this was the first to feature the now longtime vocalist Jake Lurs, and I've got to just start by saying that Truth of the Liar has one of the best opening riffs of any metalcore album ever. It's just so triumphant sounding, and you could tell right from the beginning that this was a huge step up across the board from the previous effort. I would even say that about 99.9% of fans would probably put this album at S tier because of its legacy, but I really feel like if we're being honest, it still has some of those kind of leftover generic qualities of them still starting up and kind of finding their sound. So don't get me wrong, this is an amazing album, has lots of great moments. You've got Backburner, and just to give you a little bit of a time capsule here, the video for that premiered on MySpace Music. You've got The Blinding Light, The Balance, my personal favorite, which is Composure, which is both amazingly infectious with its riffs and vocal hooks. Your demeanor looks like quicksand. And of course, you've got your own life to lead. No doubt this album is a classic, but again, there are better ones to come. Again, within the context of the time, I could see why this is just a huge stepping stone and why it was so big. So yeah, ultimately, for its legacy and everything, and just its quality and consistency, it's a solid album. I'm going to put it at A tier. It's not quite S tier. Not quite sure I feel comfortable dropping it to B tier, but I have a lot of thoughts that came up as I was re-listening to all these albums. But let's move along to 2009 with Constellations. Now, I feel like for a long time, many dismissively called this album Messengers Part 2, but to me, I feel like it's kind of the superior version of what Messengers was doing. It takes everything that album did and kind of does it better. You've got the same great riffs, but tighter production. even more consistent track listing, I would say. It particularly picks up in the second half. You've got great songs like Oceans of Apathy. You've got Indonesia, one of my favorites, and that has guest vocals from Tommy Giles Rogers from Between the Buried and Me. You got Paradox. You got Rationalist. Meddler, another fantastic mainstay right there. Mariana's Trench was actually featured on Rock Band 2. So this is one of my favorites and has been for a long time. And even one that I would probably consider S tier for that whole duration. But after, again, re-listening to all these albums, I've been starting to rethink how I feel about these. So ultimately, I think I'm going to put it at an A alongside Messengers. They're pretty close. I feel like Constellations edges it out just a little bit better. If there was like different, again, like subdivisions between it, we had like an A plus and an A minus and an S minus and so on and so forth. I think that would get too complicated, but I would put this one just a little bit higher. But enough jabbering, let's move on to 2011 with Leveler. Now, this is one that I feel like, on the flip side, was most commonly cited by fans and the community as a long time as like the redheaded stepchild of the discography. And I'm not really exactly sure why, because there's lots of great songs on this album that are among my favorites from the band. You've got Empire, Pangea, Cutting the Ties, Salt and Light, especially, like, is just total melodic bliss that would have been right at home on the next album, and may actually be one of my all-time favorite songs from the band. You've also got Carpe Diem and Internal Canon, both kind of alluding to ideas that would be further developed on Found in Faraway Places. But ultimately, like, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit disjointed. I can't really put my finger on why I don't find myself reaching for this album more so than some of the other ones, but it still made 11 on Billboard. It's still a really solid album. Ultimately, I feel like it's fair to give it a B. And again, it's weird because like there's so many solid songs to the point where it almost feels like it should be on par with Messengers and Constellations, but something's just a little bit off, and so it docks it just a little bit in that way. But let's jump forward once more to 2013 with Rescue and Restore. And this album became a fast favorite for me. It's actually the album that got me back into the band after a pretty long time of kind of just sleeping on everything. It's the most emotive album too, I would say. It's very melodic, lots of very genuine heartstring pulling moments. Arguably the most anthemic and memorable vocals of all their albums too on this one, I would say. And I love the violin and acoustic elements that start to seep in here. It's just oozing with juicy earworm guitar hooks that never leave my brain. They're just stuck in there permanently. You got great tracks like Count It All As Lost, Fault Line, Beauty and Tragedy, and the final half of Creative Captivity with that trumpet solo. Absolute perfection. If you don't get caught up in that, there is no hope for you. Like, I cannot understand a person who would not get emotionally gripped by that part of the song. There's also some heavier moments too, like the beginning of Animals, but even that one also later expands into this more proggy, experimental part, and you see these elements seeping through that would become bigger and bigger on the next album. I would say it could have a better opener if I'm nitpicking here. I think that Beauty and Tragedy would have been a great opener with that killer starting riff that it has, and Echoes would have been a better closer too. But gotta love that warm bass rumble on that song, and this one made number 9 on Billboard. The band at the time considered it to be their most ambitious work to date as they were working on it, and I got heavy gym rotation on this album. I lifted a lot of weights and did a lot of running listening to this album, and got in pretty good shape, much better shape than I am in now. So yeah, in the end, I love this album. It's definitely S tier, one of my all-time favorites, definitely in the top 3. For a long time was my favorite, but... So it's at this point that the band made the jump to Fearless Records, and in 2015 they dropped Found in Faraway Places. This album, this may be the best thing that they have ever done. I feel like they outdid themselves in every possible way on this album. The heavy parts are heavier, the proggy parts are proggier, and all of that experimentation that we keep touching on as we've talked about all these other albums finally kind of comes together here for some seriously ambitious compositions. You've still got the powerful but more typical stuff like The Wake, Identity, Everlasting Ending, Blackwood, and Jesus Christ, Vanguard is a scorcher. And while it's not my favorite song on the album, it's also kind of cool to hear Jeremy from A Day to Remember sing on Ghosts. It just feels a little bit out of place on the track listing, but I am a fan of that band, so it was kind of a cool moment. But then you've got the real highlight stuff here, the real meat of it, the more expansive, atmospheric stuff like Martyr, which turns into like a soundtrack for a Western drama. They probably could have put parts of this track behind Deadwood, save for that epic frenzy of hammer-ons and pull-offs that put a bow on the whole thing. Majoring in the minors goes for more of an old school kind of Lone Ranger vibe with woodblocks and Johnny Cash picking on the interlude. This one became an instant favorite of mine, probably top 3 tracks. Separating the Seas basically transforms into like a gypsy dance party or something out of Fiddler on the Roof in the middle. Broken Promises is a little bit more traditional in its progressive elements than these other ones, but it still ranks high among their more ambitious tracks at over 6 minutes of scorching guitars and plodding bass lines. And speaking of which, they really go all in on the solos with this album, more so than any other up to this point. So yeah, this is the one really, I think over time has become my all-time favorite August Burns Red album. Hands down. Like S tier for sure, but it actually kind of knocked Rescue and Restore out of its long-time position for me. And it just feels like it's the most ambitious and interesting and textured album that the band has ever done. But yeah, I could probably talk all day about this album. I could do like its own 30-minute video just talking about this one, but we have to move on. So let's go to 2017 with Phantom Anthem. Now, given that Found in Faraway Places set that bar so high, it feels like nothing could really hold up to that. And so it was hard to consider a follow-up, but I feel like they did a really damn good job kind of not retreading the same ground, but also just like bringing the same intensity, the same genuineness, the same great songwriting, but just sort of in a different style. It's still very progressive, lots of longer songs on this one again, but a lot more focused just on the guitars, I feel like. Just straight up slaying with those guitars. And I gotta say too, going back and re-listening to this one, after having not listened to it in a little bit of a while, like, I already really liked it, but goddamn, like, I love it. Like, there were songs on here that I wasn't even totally sure what I was sold on, but come to listen to it now, there is not a single bad song on this album. There's not even like an average song on this album. It's just so good. It's just not quite as experimental or ambitious. But yeah, you open up with King of Sorrow, which is a great track. It's even got kind of some Between the Buried and Me vibes towards the end with some of the guitar work. The Frost is just a sick single. It's kind of like the blueprint of a perfect progressive metalcore track. So many sick riffs, high energy, anthemic fun. I finally focused on what's inside! Invisible Enemy too, with that wicked tapping riff and cool little Eastern intro. Quake is super infectious with its guitars. Float has some really cool gang vocals on the intro and a really catchy hook as well. Carbon Copy is really solid. And Dangerous brings back some of the additional flavor of the previous album with its interlude before shredding it up once again with another righteous tapping guitar solo. Again, not a bad song on this album. I'm actually starting to rethink my ranking on this. Like, over time, this may join those other ones in the S tier. For now, I feel like I kind of have to put it at A tier. For a long time, I had kind of placed it behind Constellations, even potentially behind Messengers. But I've got to say, marathoning these albums now, which is what I did, like, I went back and I listened to them all in a row, and I think I like this one better than either of those two now. Like, it really has solidified itself in just a couple years' time, and there's something to be said about that. Like, I'm going to keep coming back to this album. It's a really good one, and like I said, it might move up even into that higher tier later on. But now let's finally move up to present day with 2020's Guardians. I did a full review video on this track already that you can check out. I'll try to link it right up there. But I gotta say, like, again, coming off of those last 3 albums, this one's good, but it had a lot to live up to after just 3 of my favorites in a row that all just struck me instantly. So ultimately, it kind of felt a little bit like a letdown. And again, don't let me make that sound like it's a bad album, like I don't like it. I actually quite enjoy it. There's, again, a lot of really good songs. Like I said at the very beginning, I don't think they've made a bad album or an album that I just didn't enjoy. It's just that this one feels a little bit less consistent. It feels like kind of a step back, to several step backs really, to sort of that Constellations and Messengers sound again, and just more back to basics. And that's fine. There's still plenty of solid jams in that, right? But it's sort of like, been there, done that. Like, I feel like we were on to bigger and better things. And so this wasn't what I was expecting. But yeah, the narrative is a great opener. Bones is awesome. Some seriously cool riffs on this one. Paramount has more fun gang vocals, some like oh moments that are going to be great for live performances, I'm sure. You've got Dismembered Memory. Extinct by Instinct is pretty darn catchy too. It was nice to hear the strings popping up towards the end of that one again. Bloodletter is just a total rager. I do have to say, like, the first single, Defender, I'm not a big fan of it. Although it is fun to scream, like a forest fire! Like, you know, that's cool, and headbanging to the breakdown. Ultimately, I don't know, it just doesn't do it for me, and so I think that was the beginning of me kind of being skeptical as this album was coming out. Similar feelings with The Lighthouse, too. I love the sassy little squealy melodic riff that pops up on this one. I love the groovy bass interlude and the spoken word portion, which kind of feels like a callback to Rescue and Restore again. But the singing parts just kind of ruin it for me. And I've said it a million times, if you're familiar with the channel, I am not anti-singing. There are a lot of bands I really love that do a lot of singing. I'm a big Periphery fan. I'm a BT Bam fan, even the newer stuff. But just here, like, it's not particularly good, and it just doesn't come together for me. And so it kind of takes away from an otherwise pretty solid track. You do get some proggier moments with the closing track, Three Fountains, and so that was a nice addition. It's a great closer. But really, this album, it kind of feels a little bit 50-50 for me. For every really great track, there's a kind of generic track. Even the really solid tracks, again, just feel kind of like, again, been there, done that. Nothing bad at all, just sort of less memorable, less new, like, exciting moments where I'm like, ooh, I haven't heard that before. I feel like had this come out, like, after Leveler or somewhere thereabouts, I would have been kinder to this album. I would have liked it a little bit more because it would have felt like more of a natural progression. Maybe it's just still kind of got New Kid on the Block syndrome. It does feel like it's growing on me a bit after having taken a break from all the listens I was doing in preparation for my review and coming back to it now. But it's just, it lacks a certain soul that some of the other albums really have. And it just feels a little bit hollow in this strange way. It lacks that emotional weight, despite the content and the lyrics that are very, like, passionate and emotional, but it just doesn't come through the same way for some reason. I don't know if it's the production or just particular songwriting choices, but it's like we have the same recipe, but we're missing the fresh ingredients and that special sauce that really make the dish come together. So for those reasons, I'm going to put it at a B. Again, I can't really rank it lower than that. It's because it's good. It's like a really good album, but it doesn't have the legacy of these. It's just, we'll see. Maybe over time. Time will tell if that one continues to elevate. But overall, I'm feeling pretty comfortable with this. But speaking of which, I'm really interested to hear what you all think down in the comments or on our social media. But I think that'll do it for this video. Flight of Icarus, signing off. I will see you in the trenches.